In the latter part of the 80s and the early part of the 90s, my life in New York City was dominated by AIDS activism. I was an AIDS activist. I was a member of ACT UP. ACT UP was a direct action coalition of people who took to the streets to change policy regarding AIDS in the government, in medicine, in everything. When I joined ACT UP in the fall of 1987, I thought, where do I belong? And somebody said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I'm a journalist. And they said, okay, so why don't you become part of our media committee? Well, what do? The media committee reaches out to journalists to make sure that they write about the AIDS problem, because a lot of people were ignoring it. The New York Times was, is, and remains the newspaper of record. And so if something doesn't appear in the New York Times, then it's as if it didn't happen. And the New York Times was really bad on their AIDS coverage. Fast forward to 1989. The Times, at this point, had just published an editorial. The headline, I believe, was, "Why Make AIDS Worse Than It Is?" The idea of this op-ed was, yes, AIDS is an awful thing, but there's only a finite number of people who have AIDS, and once those people who are infected pass away, then we'll have fewer people with AIDS. It was one of the most callous, tone-deaf editorials that the New York Times ever wrote. Needless to say, we, the members of ACT UP, were pissed off. This was just the crowning glory of years of ignorant coverage of the AIDS crisis. And so we decided that we were going to have a demonstration in front of the home of the New York Times publisher, and his name was Arthur Sulzberger Sr. And he was nicknamed Punch. I don't know, that was a name that came from his childhood. A bunch of us started wheat pasting nights before the demonstration. And it was all on the Upper East Side. The posters had a variety of messages that all were focused on the New York Times, saying, your coverage is going to cost lives. You've got the story wrong. And in one image we took the photo of Arthur Sulzberger Sr. and wrote on top of the poster, Punch, you fucked up. This was the prelude to the demonstration that was going to happen later that week. So this demonstration happened on a hot July afternoon at 80th and 5th Avenue, which was the home of Arthur Sulzberger Sr., right across from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And because we knew about they knew about the demonstration, the police were there as well. There were only about 100 of us. There were probably 150 cops there to protect the home of Arthur Sulzberger Sr. We realized we weren't going to get anything done here at 5th Avenue and 80th Street or 81st Street. And so the people who were negotiating the demonstration, who had organized it, said, we need to try another alternative, another strategy. And so they said, we are going to march from 81st and 5th Avenue down to 43rd Street in Broadway to Times Square to the office of the Times. We were going to bring our message of anger and protest right to the front door of the Times. And so 100 people just started marching down 5th Avenue to the Times. And the cops went crazy. What the hell are you doing? Where are you going? You know, at first they were trying to stop us, but they realized that the only thing that they could do was give us an escort. So, because otherwise we were going to create a traffic jam. So we arrived in Times Square. By now it was rush hour, and there was all this traffic there. And we were in the middle of it, 100 or 100, more than 100 people screaming and yelling and speaking out against the New York Times. And at this point, the cops said, well, what are you going to do now? We're going to go in front of the New York Times. Oh, no, you're not. Oh, really? Okay, then we're going to have a sit down right here in Times Square at rush hour. Oh, okay. Well, you can go into 43rd Street. So again, they escorted us into 43rd Street because we had stood up to them, and we got out in front of the Times and we protested. So we had the protests and we left, and the anger subsided. We were trying to point out that if the New York Times was getting the story wrong, that was going to have ramifications in the public sphere, because politicians read the New York Times to tell them what's important, and if the New York Times is trying to make AIDS seem unimportant, then politicians aren't going to fight as hard to enact AIDS policies. So we really felt good coverage in the New York Times, good AIDS coverage, was a matter of life and death, and that's why we went to protest that day. And the most interesting, most horrific part of this afterwards was that nobody wrote about it. The only newspaper willing to touch the issue was the Village Voice. And they wrote a whole piece about not only the fact that the New York Times had been bad at AIDS coverage, but also that they obviously had enough power in this city that they could also squelch any resulting coverage and summon hundreds of police at a moment's notice. There wasn't any immediate change that was yielded from that protest. Any change in their editorial policy and being better about AIDS issues and gay issues would happen a few years later, with the change of editorship and change of staff there, and the change of the times, the change of the era where people were a little bit more sensitive towards LGBTQ and AIDS issues. All the problems that brought ACT UP into being are still there now. So there is ample reason to get out there in the streets and to fight, as the slogan went, ACT UP, fight back, fight AIDS. And I think, unfortunately, that it's just as relevant now as it was over 30 years ago.